afternoon. Okay, guys, we might actually kick off now. It's 9:01 and people are coming into the room. So welcome everyone to the Problems with Petrochemicals webinar. Today we're just going to be talking about the Middle Arm development that's proposed here in Darwin. First of all, we're going to do a welcome to country. We've got Tibby Quall. He's a Larrakia elder here, a traditional owner from the land where the proposed development is, and Tibby's also the custodian of the sacred sites in the area. So welcome, Tibby.
Oh, welcome to everybody there. Yeah, good morning. Yeah, Tibby Quall. I'm a senior elder of the Cullenberg and Larrakia clan and tribe, and I am sort of representing this argument case about Middle Arm. So yeah, and I would like to welcome everybody all aboard there. Budget Nangana Gawal Darwin. That's welcome to our country. And I'm also the traditional custodian owner for sacred sites in the top end and in Darwin, and this development would also encroach on about 9 sacred sites in the area, and I am attending a meeting this morning with the Sacred Sites Authority, talk about those sites this morning. So yeah, but at the same time, I've already said that no to the development and what it will cause to the environment and to our cultural aspects and so forth, and that it's a installation that should never take place anyway. Yeah, in Darwin. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Tibby. Thanks, mate. Yeah. Okay, so I'll introduce myself. My name's Darwin Hayward. I'm the gas campaigner here at the Environment Centre NT, and I've been involved with the campaign for Middle Arm since I've been here for the last few months. And one thing that strikes everyone that I speak to about it, I do markets, and I take a big map with me. And the thing is, here in our harbour, we've already got 2 gas plants here. One of them's quite large, Impex, that's 360 hectares. The proposed development is 1,500 hectares. So when I show people on the map, especially the people that live in Palmerston, which is nearby, they get an idea of just the size and how invasive this development's going to be. So our first speaker for today will be Kirsty Howey. Kirsty's our director at the Environment Centre here, and she is going to give context on the history of Middle Arm and what it means for the NT and Darwin. And over to you, Kirsty.
Thanks so much, Rowan, and hello to everyone wherever you are. Thanks so much for zooming in to hear about what is planned for our beautiful harbour. And thanks, Rowan and Naish from EC&T for setting this up, and thank you so much, Tibby, for that welcome to country. We're really grateful to have you as part of this campaign. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from, and I'm also going to be speaking about Larrakia country, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. And I like to show this image when I talk about Middle Arm, because this is the place that we're talking about. It's Middle Arm in the middle of beautiful Darwin Harbour, a place we all love. Darwin Harbour is itself a site of conservation significance, and it's an iconic and beautiful place. It's had some industrial development, which has had impacts, but what's proposed now is unprecedented, certainly for our harbour, and arguably we haven't really seen a development like this proposed anywhere else in Australia. So this shows just what is at stake, this image. So until quite recently, not many people in Darwin had heard of petrochemicals, much less understood their impacts, but how quickly that has changed. And today I'll be walking you through just the history of this proposal to construct a range of petrochemicals factories in Darwin Harbour and just what that means for all of us living here. So in October, the new Labor government made an announcement that took many of us by surprise, probably not us at the Environment Centre, but many people around Australia by surprise. They said they'd commit $1.5 billion of taxpayer funds for a development at Middle Arm in Darwin Harbour, which is an extraordinary amount of money by any measure, but it's, you know, it's absolutely massive for a small jurisdiction like the Northern Territory, and I can't think of any similar kind of spend here in my time here over 18 years. So it was framed as a federal election commitment, and people might remember Barnaby Joyce flying into Darwin and announcing $2 billion for a massive port in Darwin Harbour and some intrigue about what the port was for. But Labor very, very quickly matched that funding commitment during the campaign, and Resources Minister Madeleine King FIFO'd, choppered in and out of Darwin in July to confirm the funding after the election. And since that federal funding announcement, which catapulted this to an issue of national political significance, there's been a furious debate here in the Northern Territory and also in Canberra about what this, this development really is. And this is now an infamous set of statements within mere hours of each other by our Chief Minister and also Minister Madeleine King. And since then, the government here in the Northern Territory has apparently directed the IT team to delete references to petrochemicals from communications material about Middle Arm. So petrochemicals has very quickly become a dirty word here in Darwin. But what is planned for this site? So what is proposed at Middle Arm is inextricably linked to gas and associated petrochemicals industry in every conceivable way. And this map shows how the Northern Territory is in many ways ground zero for the gas industry, and all pipelines lead to Darwin and Middle Arm in particular. We have Santos's proposed highly polluting Barossa gas field north of the Tiwi Islands, opposed by Tiwi traditional owners who just the week before last managed to stop drilling or have a confirmation from the federal court that drilling north of the Tiwi Islands was unlawful, which was a huge win. This gas is proposed to travel by pipeline to backfill Santos's LNG facility at Middle Arm. To the south, we have the untapped and so far unproven fields of the Beetaloo Basin, which if opened up could increase Australia's emissions by a whopping 22%. And the genesis of Middle Arm goes back a long way, but when the moratorium on fracking in the Beetaloo Basin was lifted back in 2018, one of the first things the Morrison government did was enter into an MOU with the Northern Territory government to develop a plan for how it would reach production. The MOU was only publicly released to the Senate inquiry into fracking in the Beetaloo Basin last year, and it quite explicitly recommends the creation of a Middle Arm Industrial Hub to help establish gas-based manufacturing services and establish the Northern Territory as a world-class gas production, manufacturing and services hub. So gas-based manufacturing is about making petrochemicals, things like plastics, fertilizers, paints and other products using gas. And it's about providing an alternative market for Beetaloo and offshore gas and locking in massive expansion of fossil fuel production in the process. So it's highly emitting, as you'll hear during the webinar today, and very harmful for human health, but more on that later. So Andrew Liveris is a former Darwin boy and a former boss of Dow Chemicals. He was also an advisor to former President Donald Trump. And he's been advocating for a petrochemicals facility in Darwin Harbour for a decade. He was part of an advisory body appointed by the Morrison government, which came up with the so-called gas-fired recovery to respond to the COVID crisis, which people thought was dead and buried with the Labor coming in May. He was also appointed co-chair of the Territory Economic Reconstruction Commission, where he recommended the establishment of a bigger NT gas industry, including petrochemicals facilities in Darwin. Now, everyone knows petrochemicals facilities aren't likely to be politically popular. One only has to look at similar facilities, which we'll hear about today, which have led to shocking impacts on health, particularly on African-American populations. So Middle Arm has had a rebrand. Now it's a sustainable development precinct, and a strategic environmental assessment is underway. The word petrochemicals has been studiously avoided by politicians here for at least a year, and now federal politicians appear to be infected by the same disease. Green hydrogen and critical minerals processing are included in the mix of industries that could operate there, as well as a carbon capture and storage facility. And they're the things we tend to hear about, not the petrochemicals. But the problem is that government documents, plans and presentations clearly show it's for petrochemicals and gas industry expansion. So this map of Middle Arm shows that about 2/3 of the precinct is for gas, with a little bit on the right of the image for hydrogen, perhaps green hydrogen, not clear, and critical minerals processing. And here's a screenshot of the Territory Economic Reconstruction's interim report, which shows just sort of how the planning for Middle Arm has proceeded. And so there was a gas industry reference group established at least back as far as 2020, which has met quarterly since that time to support master planning for low emissions petrochemicals manufacturing at Middle Arm. And that group comprises Chemistry Australia. Dow has a member on the board of Chemistry Australia, APPIA, the gas industry peak body, the Australian Pipelines and Gas Association, and Manufacturing Australia. I don't know if this group still meets, but it was certainly in full swing in 2020. And finally, the environmental assessment documents say Middle Arm has been designed to have petrochemicals manufacturing and other gas industry expansion as well. So if built, this zone would accelerate some of Australia's biggest gas projects, becoming a foundational demand source for gas and other hydrocarbons from the Beetaloo Basin and offshore. And these are the kinds of industries that we see proposed for Middle Arm. This was a gas industry presentation that was made in either 2020 or 2021 to the gas industry, and the list on the left there is, a range of petrochemicals, including ammonia, urea, methanol, ethane, gas to liquids cluster, amongst other industries. There's also been quite a poor process behind the funding for Middle Arm. As far as we know, there's been no cost-benefit analysis. One certainly hasn't been disclosed to the public. We don't think there's been a climate impact analysis or a climate risk analysis, and there's been no public health analysis or report that we're aware of. The business case isn't publicly available. And the funding was committed without advice from Infrastructure Australia, the agency whose job it is to give advice on infrastructure spending. And that was admitted by Infrastructure Australia at a Senate inquiry a couple of months ago. The environmental assessment to justify the funding has not yet occurred. It's far from being approved at either territory or Commonwealth levels, and we're currently in the middle of a strategic environmental assessment for the development. And one of the objectives of this process is to allow projects on Middle Arm to be able to get an overarching environmental approval, and then subsequently individual projects may be able to be ticked off in as little as 60 days. So we're very much engaged in this environmental impact assessment. And we'll be talking to many people across the Northern Territory and elsewhere about getting engaged in this as well. And there's the approval sort of timeframes there. So back to petrochemicals. what we did with the scenario that had been presented by the Northern Territory government to the gas industry was we provided it to a US environmental scientist. His name is Dr. Michael Petroni. He's an expert in air quality and has worked on similar sites in the US to tell us what the impacts might be if this precinct went ahead. And Dr. Petroni's report, we were quite shocked by, to be honest, in terms of the likely or potential impacts if the scenario went ahead that had been put out by the Northern Territory government. So in particular, we're talking about an increase in fine particulate air pollution by over 500%. This could lead to 15 premature deaths per year in the Darwin region, have a considerable cost on our health system. I think he quantified that at maybe an additional $75 million per year, lead to a 4-fold increase in industrial cancer hazard in the Darwin region, and cause a 75% increase in the Northern Territory's greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not even taking into account the Beetaloo and offshore gas fields and their emissions that will feed this precinct. That's not to mention the significant accident risk posed by these facilities around the world, noting, of course, that this will be located just 3 kilometres from the suburbs of Palmerston. And just this morning, we've had a report by the ABC here that the Northern Territory Fire and Rescue Service have raised significant concerns about their capacity to respond to accidents on the site. And there's some quotes there that you can read about their concerns, and they say that it could place the community at risk in the event of multiple emergencies should they occur. Also, just to, for good measure, let's throw in some climate risk modelling, some sea level rise modelling for Middle Arm, and it shows that Middle Arm is likely to be underwater by 2100 due to the impacts of climate change and principally sea level rise, and perhaps as early as 2050. That's a terrible irony, but that's the facts. So according to our federal and Northern Territory politicians, and despite all evidence to the contrary, this is not about petrochemicals and gas industry expansion, but about renewable industries. We've been told we're lying, and that's despite the evidence that I've shown you on this in my presentation, and this quote by key Beetaloo player, Tamboran Resources, to the Senate on the 10th of October this year. And also just noting that I attended a presentation by the NT Gas Task Force in October, a few days after Tamboran had made that statement, and it showed that the balanced scenario for Middle Arm still, according to Northern Territory government planning, contains those industries with a majority of petrochemicals. So we've got, gas to liquids cluster, blue hydrogen, ammonia, urea, methanol, and ethane. These are petrochemicals. So that's all I really wanted to say. And I just wanted to conclude by saying that Middle Arm's always been planned to be about gas industry expansion on a pretty vast scale. It will be a huge source of emissions in its own right if it goes ahead, and it may provide a new justification to open up the carbon bomb of the Beetaloo Basin and other gas fields, and that's what it was designed to do. So until petrochemicals and gas is removed from the plans, this $1.5 billion that's been committed for the site is a fossil fuel subsidy. And I will just really encourage people to get involved in this campaign. Please, you can take action right now. Today, you can send this email to the Chief Minister, a submission saying no to petrochemicals in Darwin Harbour. And that will then enable us to contact you about all the things that we propose to do in the next 12 months, particularly as the environmental impact assessment is underway. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Kirsty. That was a great wrap up of the issues. So there you have it, the petrochemical plant in Darwin Harbour that, according to the government, isn't going to be a petrochemical plant. Okay, just to let everyone know, we've got the Q&A function open here. So if anyone's got any questions for any of the speakers here, if you could just pop them into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar here. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce Dr. Kimberly Terrell, Dr. Terrell is a research scientist and director of community engagement at Tulane University's Environmental Law Clinic in New Orleans, Louisiana. She is an expert on the health impacts of petrochemical facilities to neighbouring communities. Thanks, Kim. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I just started sharing my screen, so everyone should be able to hear me and also to see a title slide. Wave your arms if you can't see it, but otherwise I'll plow right ahead. I'm an environmental scientist by training, but I work at what's called an environmental law clinic, which is part of a law school that provides free legal assistance to communities dealing with environmental challenges. And I want to start very quickly by telling you a little bit about where I am and what our institution does to provide some important context. We have been around for more than 30 years, and we do what's called client-focused environmental advocacy. So we don't have our own agenda. We work on the issues that people bring to us. And most often that issue is industrial pollution. And we are in a pretty heavily industrialized part of the United States. And it would seem to be a pretty straightforward thing, you know, to ensure that people aren't exposed to unsafe levels of industrial pollution, but it's a lot more complicated than it seems. And I'm going to talk kind of at big picture as to why that is. But to give you a little bit of context, we are in the state of Louisiana, which is in the southeast United States. And we have industrial facilities across our state. So each point on this map is an industrial facility that releases significant amounts of air pollution above a threshold that requires it to report to the state, along with our rail lines and our pipelines. And so the southeast corner of our state is home to a high density of industrial facilities that has given our region the nickname Cancer Alley. Industry prefers the industrial corridor. But the one thing that we can all agree on is that we have a higher density of chemical and petrochemical plants here in our area than most anywhere else in the world. And this is what it looks like on the ground. So most of these plants in our region border the Mississippi River, which drains 2/3 of the water in the United States. It's a huge watershed. And as you can see from this image, there are no buffer zones between these plants and nearby communities. A lot of these plants were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, so they've been around a long time. We've had decades to figure out whether this was a good idea or not. And so we are kind of, you know, in one possible future for y'all in Australia. So I think I was invited here to kind of show, you know, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. This is, you know, my understanding of what's been proposed for Middle Arm from Mike Petroni's expert report. And it was interesting to me, you know, to look at it because there's a lot of things that are familiar here to me, right? Ammonia plants, LNG plants, petrochemical plants. And so it's also interesting to hear that y'all have kind of focused on the term petrochemical, because to me, living here, LNG, ammonia, you know, blue hydrogen, all of those terms are just as concerning as petrochemical. All of those types of facilities have pretty significant emissions or air pollution associated with them. But so I want to kind of talk about the three big problems with heavy industry, because I think these are, at least the first two, are kind of common misconceptions, right? So you think, okay, you have a plant, you know, it emits some amount of pollution. You just slap up a monitor and you make sure it's safe, right? It's not that simple. I wish it was that simple. So the first issue is that it's really hard to characterize risk. So a typical industrial facility emits, you know, a dozen or more different types of pollutants. This is, I know it's small text, but this is a page from an air permit for a plastics manufacturing plant that's proposed close to where I live. And so you'll see a long list, kind of the point here is that there's a long list of different toxic air pollutants, as well as, the list at the top is kind of the more common industrial pollutants. And one thing that really stood out to me reading through that expert report that Mike Petroni wrote is that it sounds like Australia is not in the habit of monitoring for toxic air pollutants. And there are more than 200 different toxic air pollutants that are associated with heavy industry. Each individual plant emits, a complex mixture of those. And an industrial landscape, whoops, sorry, that was out of order, but an industrial landscape, can contain easily several dozen different types of pollutants in different quantities, right? And so each one of these things is known to cause health problems, but that knowledge generally comes from laboratory studies, right? So let's take a controlled environment. Let's, expose an animal model to a known quantity of this particular chemical, and then develop knowledge about the mechanisms of toxicity for that one chemical, right? But in reality, people are exposed to much more complex mixtures of pollutants. Benzene is a pretty common industrial pollutant that's associated with petrochemical facilities, but also things like plastics plants, other types of chemical manufacturing. And it's probably an example of a pollutant that affects almost every bodily system, right? So every pollutant affects your lungs, right? Your lungs are your body's largest surface area that comes into contact with the outdoor environment. And pollutants are regulated because they're known to cause health problems, right? We don't regulate steam. We don't regulate things that are harmless. Benzene is known to cause cancer. It's also known to disrupt the blood system. It inhibits the production of red blood cells, so it can cause, various types of disorders. And when you look at these kinds of hazardous sheets, typically they talk up front about the immediate impacts, right, from being exposed to very high quantities of things. What's harder to discern oftentimes are the long-term impacts, right? The impacts that you get from years and years and years of being exposed to this. One other challenge is that not everybody is equally susceptible. There's some kind of interesting recent research that suggests that women who are going through puberty or menopause may be more susceptible to the risk of breast cancer from pollution exposure. So we have these windows of susceptibility throughout our lives that also complicate this equation. This is a table of the predicted impacts from that expert report. The things that jump out at me are that, depending on what type of pollutant we're talking about, the project would, double, triple, and in some cases up to 800 times increase the amount of industrial pollution in this area. And Dr. Petroni predicted a 4-fold increase in industrial cancer risk, or I should say cancer risk from industrial pollution. So it's, from an emissions standpoint, it's a very significant impact. And the other thing that stood out to me is that there's 3 monitors for particulate matter pollution in this area, which, is more than we have where I live, but still, not nearly sufficient to characterize what people are actually being exposed to. We know from research that there can be really significant variation in air quality between a few city blocks. So this is a map from a study that was done on the West Coast of the United States, where basically a company drove around a car that had air monitoring equipment attached to it in order to measure the block by block variation in air quality. And so red dots are worse air quality, blue dots are better air quality. And you can see that, from one block to the next, you can really get pretty major variations. And so, keep in mind that this is a snapshot in time. It wouldn't be feasible to generate this kind of fine scale information for an entire year, right? Typically, you have a trade-off in air quality monitoring. You can get a lot of information at one location, right? You can measure air quality for an entire year continuously at one spot, or you can, drive around and take a bunch of samples and get a better understanding of neighborhood air quality, for a very limited period of time. And we know that, seasonal changes in air direction and seasonal changes in industrial operations can have really significant impacts. Monitoring is also expensive, right? So there's been a kind of a proliferation of low-cost community monitors. In the US, we have a company called Purple Air that a lot of people are excited about. And you get what you pay for with air monitoring, right? If a $100 monitor gave you a sufficient picture of air quality, our agencies wouldn't be spending thousands of dollars on high-tech equipment. So those low-cost monitors are really good for telling you if there's a pollution spike, but they're not good to tell you like the precise level of pollution. They provide more like qualitative information as opposed to quantitative or hard number information. So this is a used particulate monitor that you can buy, right? So this measures one type of pollutant. Once you get this thing, you need to put it in a climate controlled shed, right? Which is, a significant cost. And again, that gives you information about one individual pollutant at one location. If you want to measure toxics, there are not, the technology is not as well developed. So typically to measure toxic air pollution, you're collecting canisters of air like the one you see here, sending it off to a lab, and a month later, you get the result. So you don't have the same ability to continuously monitor air quality for toxic air pollutants that you have for kind of your more standard pollutants like particulate matter. And so it's really not feasible to fully characterize exposures in any community, right? At best, we're getting a partial picture of what some people are exposed to for some amount of time. And, we hear a lot about clean energy, especially in our region. We're seeing, biodiesel projects, blue hydrogen projects, LNG export facilities. And it's always ironic to me when people refer to these types of projects as clean energy, because yes, natural gas, may be clean burning, but it is not clean to produce. So this is a table of emissions from an air permit application for an LNG plant that's being proposed in our region. And they have a few different scenarios of, what they might want to build. But under every scenario, they will emit massive amounts of all the standard pollutants, as well as a long list of toxic air pollutants. So again, it's not just oil, it's other types of industrial projects that we see here. Agencies don't regulate the overall risk from industrial pollution, right? This is true both in the US and in Australia. Agencies are kind of set up to deal with one pollutant at a time. And so, you'll have legal limits for individual pollutants, but you can easily imagine a situation where, the level is just below that maximum threshold and a person's overall risk is higher than what might be conveyed. And it's challenging, right? Because we don't really understand the overall risk from these mixtures of pollutants. So this is a study that looked at 2 individual pollutants and found that when you put them together, they're more harmful than the sum of their parts, right? So exposure to nitrogen dioxide worsens the effect of particulate pollution on the cardiovascular system. Similarly, there's been studies that have found that when you breathe in particulate pollution, those particles can act as essentially a transport system for toxics, for things like benzene, to get further into your bloodstream than they would be able to on their own. And so it's really hard to kind of connect health outcomes to industrial exposures. And one of the biggest reasons for that is because it's hard to measure exposures, right? So for all the reasons we just talked about, pollution is complex, it's expensive to measure, it varies dramatically across space and time. And so you can imagine if you're not measuring what people are exposed to accurately, studies are not going to find that link between that exposure and that health outcome, right? It took us decades to figure out that smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer. It's really easy to figure out if people smoke and how much they smoke and what's in a cigarette, right? It's way harder to figure out what kind of air pollution people are exposed to from industrial facilities. People also move around. In epidemiology, they call it loss to follow-up, right? People don't stay in one place. They move throughout their daily lives. They also relocate geographically. And every disease that's caused by pollution also has other causes, right? So it can be really hard to disentangle the effects of asthma, of cancers, of COPD, and other respiratory diseases, because industry can always blame that on diet, lifestyle, smoking, drinking, right? Those are the things we hear over and over in our part of the world. Oh, it's not the 36 tons of benzene each year that we pump out. It's because people don't exercise enough. That's why you have poor health outcomes. And the burden of proof is always on the community. Nobody is ever going to say, okay, we're going to prove that it's safe to operate this plant. We're going to do a study, no, it's going to be, okay, prove that, this operation is causing health problems. And that's not an easy thing to do because diseases don't happen immediately and they're not detected immediately. So even so, in Louisiana, when we look at the data, across decades and across an entire state with a population of about 2 million people, we do see that relationship, right? But we really have to look at very big populations in order for that link to kind of rise above the noise. It's not, if cancer research was easy, we would have solved cancer by now. And again, we have these time delays, right? So you're exposed, to a toxin at some point in time. That has a damaging effect on your DNA. At some point, those mutations accumulate and trigger the cells, in this case, to proliferate and form a tumor. But then there's some delay before that actually gets detected and develops clinically. So again, connecting health outcomes to exposures is incredibly challenging. And this latency period can be years or decades. So for lung cancer, typically it takes over a decade between when a person, is exposed and then develops and then finally is diagnosed with this disease. And then lastly, disasters happen, right? So everything we've talked about is kind of chronic and long-term, but we know that, with every facility, there's a risk. And I suspect that the talking points that you're hearing in Australia are the same things we hear over here in the US. Oh, we have technology now. Oh, we have a commitment to safety. There are a lot of commitments to safety out there, right? Nobody ever goes in and builds a chemical plant and says, well, it might explode. There might be a fire. There might be a leak. But these things happen very regularly. And I think the other thing that might be unexpected is that it doesn't have to be a massive fire and explosion. A leak of ammonia can be fatal, right? So we have recent examples in the US of industrial workers being killed from ammonia leaks. We have examples of people intentionally setting fires in these facilities, which is another huge risk that we don't often talk about, right? We typically think of accidents, we don't think of sabotage. And then even, infrastructure that's not currently being used can pose a risk. So in Louisiana last year, a teenager was killed by an empty storage tank that had accumulated some vapors and exploded right near her home. And in the US, we have an organization, a federal agency called the Chemical Safety Board. You can visit it and scroll through and see, once a month or so, there's some investigation that's wrapped up, some fire, some leak, some explosion. And so, again, this is in the United States, right? Like if you ask the people here, they'll say we are the leaders, in petrochemical manufacturing. We have the skills, we have, tight environmental regulations. And even so, we see these kinds of issues pretty regularly. So I want to wrap up with some key points. It's really expensive to monitor pollution, and even with all the money and all the equipment, you're still only going to get a partial understanding of people's exposure. The burden is going to be on the community to show that they're experiencing negative health impacts from these types of plants, right? And that's going to take decades to be able to do, and it may not be possible, right? The community might be, so small that, that study doesn't see that association. People move around. But we also know that there's a very real risk of more immediate threats like fires, leaks, and other disasters. And I included this picture. This is just down the street from where I live. You'll see it's a music festival. It's, very valuable real estate in the city of New Orleans. And right behind it, you can see two smokestacks from an old power plant that used to operate in our city that hasn't operated since the 70s and is still standing there on some of the most valuable real estate in the city, because it's not easy to dismantle and decommission and remediate these sites, right? It's an incredible cost. It's a significant risk. And so it's been easier for the city to just let that old structure stand than to try to figure out how to dismantle it and clean up the site. So with that, I want to turn it back over to the hosts, and thank you for the opportunity to share my experience with you all.
Wow, thank you very much, Kim. That was quite disconcerting, really. Wanted a bunch of reasons not to build this plant in the harbour. That's them right there. Okay, so next up we have Diane Wilson. Diane is a former shrimp boat captain. We call them prawn boat captains here in Australia, in Port Lavaca, Texas. She's been fighting for over 30 years against pollution from heavy industry, which has had devastating impacts on the local population and fisheries. Author of several books, including An Unreasonable Woman and Diary of an Eco Outlaw, Diane starred in the recent Netflix documentary Point Comfort. We'll put the link for the documentary in the chat box there, but yeah, welcome, Diane.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm gonna try to, trying to find my,
Yeah, so of course, one of the reasons that people come to the Northern Territory and Darwin is is we've got a pristine, fairly pristine environment up here, and we all come here because, and not just us, but the tourists and all those guys as well. They come here because of our natural beauty here. To build a massive industrial complex in the harbour goes against all of that and goes against the values of most Territorians. So that's one of the reasons we don't really like it.
Okay, can you see it?
No.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh, good.
Give me a second.
I've got it on my screen.
Maybe
So-
Diane, go back down to the share screen button again, and it's a green button with an arrow, and click on that.
Okay, let me see if I can
See if we can do it again.
Okay.
And while we're waiting, I'll share that Diane has been a great ally for communities here where I am, because they're trying to build the type of plant that exists in Diane's community here in Louisiana. And so anytime you can kind of show up and say, you know, this is what they promised, and then this is what happened, I think that's really powerful. Oh, did we lose Diane completely?
Maybe.
She's back.
Okay.
You can take yourself off mute, Diane.
Oh, you know, just share. There.
Yay.
Yay.
Oh,
Okay, wait a minute. Well, let
Okay.
me get up to start. Okay, here we go. All right. First of all, I will be talking about a very specific chemical plant, a plastic plant in Point Comfort, Texas. It's right on the Texas Gulf Coast. This is similar to the one that they're trying to build in Louisiana. And on a chemical plant, you can talk about air emissions, you can talk about accidents, you can talk about flares, you can talk about the PVC dust, the plastic pollution. And so with this one, you know, like you can see the flares in the hometown of Point Comfort there. It's right next door to the school. In fact, the school is not there anymore. They moved the kids out, they moved the schools out because it was too dangerous. And so I am, all right. So the thing about Formosa Plastics, you know, you talked about air emissions. Well, I'm talking about water emissions and water discharges, because Formosa's plant shares the same bays that the shrimpers share, the oystermen, the crabbers, and just the recreational fishermen out there. That is our community is historically a commercial fisheries communities, a whole county that is surrounded by water. And like I said, Formosa is the predominant person that hires people in our community. And so we have these issues. And so what I'm mainly going to talk about is the plastic pollution that you see from a plastic plant. Most people don't realize that you not only have the PVC dust, the polyethylene dust, the polypropylene, you have the pellets, you have it in the water, you have it on the well, I guess on the top right, you'll see this is a unit. There are 17 units that this chemical plant has. And this plant started out 100 workers. Now they have expanded until now it's a $8 billion plant, and there's 3,000 workers. It is like it's bigger than my hometown. And there are 17 units, and the one in the far right it happens to be 9 stories, and they have a emission accident of plastic from the valves breaking or from an overload, and it covers all 9 stories, and it's open. So it goes into the countryside. So you had plastic powder and on this, it's PVC. So it's polyvinyl chloride. It's vinyl chloride. It causes cancer. And this powder goes all over the fields, the creeks, the bays. And so as you can see, the one in the far bottom left, that is powder on the water where your fishermen are at, your crabbers are out there, your oystering, it's going over the oyster reefs. And this is pretty typical. This is the many ways that the plastic get into the water. First, on the top left over there, you'll see Formosa in the background, but they have a probably around 9 million gallons per day of toxic discharge into Lavaca Bay. This is where the fisheries are. This is where the oyster reefs are. This is where the shrimpers used to ply their trade there. And so you'll see on the top, that is just a storm outfall. That's not an industrial discharge. That's a storm outfall meant only to hold rainwater. It's big enough to hold an airplane, and there's 10 of these. This facility, and it's probably pretty typical in a petrochemical plastic plant, 10 stormwater discharges, and they go into the water. And you know what the water looks like at that bottom left? That's outfall 6, stormwater outfall, except there's plastic, there's pellets, there's powder, and it goes out into the rivers, the creeks, and the bay. And that bottom right, it shows, I believe that's outfall, stormwater outfall 8. And like I said, when we were investigating this, we went to all of these outfalls. And this is what in the SPVC unit, they call that a specialized PVC. So that means when you have customers that wants a very special type of PVC powder, this is the unit that makes it. But this is what the unit looks like probably every single week, because there are accidents. And if you see that vacuum truck in the far right, top right, and you see that flare in the top, they had an upset. They had a problem. And there was so much PVC powder and slurry with vinyl chloride that big vacuum truck, that is the biggest one they had loaded it and unloaded 3 times. And that was the 3rd trip, and the tire blew out. And like I said, this is sort of typical in your community. And I can tell you, this plastic plant is a street away from the community, 1 street. This is where you see the powder. Like the powder, you have these 17 units, and things break, things are open. Formosa likes to brag that they make 1 trillion pellets a day. So there is no big deal about losing powder. You know, so it's in the roads, it's in the ditches. Here it is. Like I said, on the far bottom left is what a powder emission looks like. And the workers around it, they're breathing it. As you can see, this worker on the bottom right, this is worker. So there's people that are promised these jobs. You see that guy there, the bottom right? he had to go to the local store and buy a handkerchief because they didn't provide him masks because he's breathing vinyl chloride powered. And like I said, the top right, it's where when it rains, the plant floods. So that is water flooding from a plant that has been saturated with plastic powder and plastic pellets. So you can see it goes everywhere. And this is another way where there is a lot of pellets lost. This is the railway when they put the pellets and the powder in the railway cars, because Formosa puts it by trains and by trucks, and you have pellets that are spilled through the trains and through the trucking. And I think in when we did the lawsuit against Formosa, we got discovery documents, and they talked about losing 14, you see those railway cars, 14 of them lost over 1,200,000 pounds of pellets. And this is the one this is a documentation that we had in discovery. And so I pulled it and it's talking about the releases. When I was talking about the stormwater outfalls, that is only supposed to carry the rainwater. It's like the notation up there in that little blue heading is in one release into that rainwater outfall, they lost 170,000 pounds of pellets in one place in one day. And this company had been doing it for 26 years. They never reported it. The state never did anything, and the EPA never did anything. And you talk about there's regulations in the United States. Mostly it's self-reported, and the companies, a lot of times they do not report it. And that's what's part of Formosa's problem, and a lot of chemical plants do, is you have to trust that they will be a good citizen and report all these violations. And so the thing of it is this is what it comes to, is if you have a company that behaves this bad, is that in the state won't do anything, the federal government, EPA won't do anything, the company won't do anything, your elected officials won't do anything, because you will find out the elected officials get contracts with the companies. So nobody does anything. So I and myself and 3 workers from the plant, we walked 20-mile area, walked the beaches, the marshes, finally got a kayak, went into the outfalls for 2.5 years to document their pollution, because nobody would believe it. And as I believe you were talking about the first time when they said there isn't a petrochemical plant, or there's you know, they don't show any recognition that there's going to be anything at all. You cannot believe how many times I got face to face with Formosa and said, how many plastics are you losing? And they said, we do not lose a single pellet. And the thing that, so it's you have to prove it. And the thing that is that's pretty bad when a fisherwoman and 2 injured workers have to enforce environmental regulations for the community and for your own communities. And so these were the places, these little colored things are the different places we went to find pellets and powder. And as you see in the town of Point Comfort, right up there is where Formosa is at. And we checked all over the bays, all over the creeks, all over the shores. We went up the creeks, we went into their outfalls. And we got, and this is where, like I said, you would find pellets and powder on the shores of the river, and you would find them on the beaches. You would find them on the vegetation, that is on the leaves of the vegetation, that is powder, polyethylene and polypropylene powder. This is what a sample looks like. And we got it with the pool net, like your home pool, one of those big nets, that is how many pellets were out there from this chemical plant discharging them. That was a typical sample. And this is, if you look closely, that is a floating aquatic plant, and all those pellets, they are stuck in the roots of that plant. It is like any plant you go and you pull up, and it is embedded with all of the plastic plants. And this is what the powder looks like on the water. You know, you have fishermen going out there. You have sportsmen wanting to go out there. You have tourists that want to go out fishing in your harbor. We find this in the harbors where the outboard motors are at, where the yachts are at, where the shrimp boats. You go down to the shrimp boats, you will find that powder sticking to the rim of the hull of their boats. It's in the oysters. There have been oystermen shucking oysters, and they find plastic and pellets inside the oyster. And they find them within the fish that they catch. And this was pretty much the team, and they were injured workers, and they no longer worked at the plant any longer. So you can see we waded out into the creek with little pool nets. You can see us up in the outfalls, stormwater outfalls. I think below you can see the below right is he actually was a whistleblower and was fired for speaking out. And I think that top right, it's me on the kayak. I got to handle a kayak pretty darn good. And like I said, we tracked Formosa's plastic violations for 2.5 years. Probably every single day we went out and got samples. We had over 2,500 samples. We probably had around 12,000 photos and videos. You can see they're all hand done. And you see how we documented it. I literally typed up the first sample, where it was at, what time, and there were over 50 pages that we turned in to the judge when we finally went to court. And as you see, there's a goat truck right there, and all of those pellets were put in those Tupperware boxes, and we hauled them into the courthouse. And this is and of this case, it just shows you that never give up, because I am a high school graduate. My water keepers were injured workers. They were fired, and we had no money. So a legal aid, the Texas Rio Grande legal aid, became our lawyers, because we were literally indigent, and we filed a citizen clean water suit against Formosa Plastics, and we won the case. We got a $50 million settlement, and we got zero discharge of plastic. And not only did we get that, is we get to do the enforcement, and every time Formosa violates the plastic zero discharge, we give them a fine. And at this point, it's I think a little over a year from when we started doing this. It's almost $9 million. And we have put every penny into our community because these plants destroy the community. For most of plastics, it started 100 workers and it grew to 3,000 workers. It took over the community. Half the landowners' houses rented there, they left the community. The school left. Formosa now runs the school as their training for their for their workers. So the community is gone. It is there no longer. And you have one huge gigantic plant that wants to keep expanding, and that's what else they will do. They will keep trying to expand. And I always said the only thing I regretted, and I fought Formosa for 34 years, is that I did not try hard enough. You do not want these plants in there. This was our little legal team. We had a lot of great women in there. And like I said, I didn't pay a penny in that lawsuit. That's what was amazing. It was a legal aid group. And anyway, so that's my email address up there. I got a little website that's got all of the documentation you ever need if you want to know about plastic. And I'll be glad to share any kind of documentation I have. I've got probably at this point 18,000 photos, videos, documents, and share anything I got. So thank you very much, and do not let that plant come in there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Diane. Especially powerful, coming from someone who lost their own industry with the shrimp there. One thing the people of the territory love is fishing, and we certainly don't want to see this kind of pollution in our harbour here. So full respect to yourself and to the waterkeepers for the fight, and Dr. Terrell as well. Full respect to you as well for fighting, and we can see what happens after the fact, after these plants are built. So as Diane was just saying, we've got a chance right now to stop this before it happens. And I think the same will happen up here. Once they get their foot in the door, it'll just be more expansion after more expansion till the whole harbour's full, and we're a sacrifice zone. Okay, so we're going to go across to some questions now. I've got the first question from Rosalie to everyone. Can you discuss NT developments in framework of massive gas developments in WA? Are they in competition? Are we as opponents of these developments collaborating effectively? Just quickly, I think I can answer this one in part. The massive gas developments in WA are different corporations, so they're in competition as far as corporations are in competition with each other, but they have their own markets. Are we as opponents of these developments collaborating effectively? I think we are. We meet with the guys from Environment Kimberly and all the other Lock the Gate people on that in WA as well. So they've got a massive fight on their hands over there as well, and we help out them and they help us out as much as we can. Okay, I'm just going to go to the Q&A section here. To Diane Wilson, would you be legally able to do the sampling and tracking that you did now? I'm wondering about authorities clamping down on citizen monitoring.
I think right now there has been so much publicity on it, is that I go pretty much where I want. And I even now, believe it or not, I've been arrested quite a few times, but now I literally have a key to Formosa's gate, and I go onto that site when I want to. So it just is persistence. And no, I'm there all the time. I just left there a little earlier, right before I got here. I'd been out there all evening.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Oh, it was just a thank you from Justin Tuddy. Thanks, Diane, for all your efforts to promote environmental care in the face of pollution and peace in the face of war. Okay, do we have any more in the chat? Okay, so just a reminder to sign on to our letter to the Chief Minister. The links in the chat box there, but we're going to send around an email after this with the link to the video online for any, if you want to share it with anyone else, and we'll have all of the links that we've had in our chat box here.
Rowan, I just noticed there was a question about sort of the regulatory context and whether regulation will save us.
Cool. Can you speak to that,
I'd
please,
quite like to answer that, and I'd actually really like Diane and Kim to also weigh in. So the question was, sort of a couple of people said the regulatory context in the US seems very poor. Like I just would, I guess, push up against that and note that we in the Northern Territory have a particular context here that really you need to understand the scale of the risk and why regulation is not going to save us. And I don't accept that Australia's regulatory system is any better than the US's. And in fact, just looking at the example of fracking, we've directly imported the US's model for regulating fracking here into our Northern Territory regulatory frameworks. But I just first wanted to note that this is a sort of unprecedented development in Australia, we believe, and we're not sure who has the regulatory capacity and ability to appropriately regulate the kinds of impacts associated with this facility as a general rule. But in the Northern Territory, and I was a lawyer here, been a lawyer for 20 years, including an environmental lawyer. I did my PhD on environmental regulation in the Northern Territory. And what we have here, we cover a sixth of Australia's landmass, but we only have 250,000 people here in the Northern Territory. And we have got a shocking record of environmental regulation. We've got a very, very small population base from which to draw expertise. And we have an absolute hunger for development at any cost. And corners are cut constantly in the quest to get the Northern Territory to a similar level of development, in inverted commas, as other parts of Australia, instead of recognising that we've got something truly unique here because we do have intact landscapes in all sorts of different respects, but including, you know, a large proportion of Darwin Harbour. And, you know, I don't know a mine in the Northern Territory that's not polluting a waterway. We've got the most toxic mine in Australia, which is MacArthur River Mine, which will destroy that river system if it continues as it's currently being regulated, in inverted commas. And there is no way, and I know there are very good people working in the EPA here and in the Northern Territory Environment Department who I have a great deal of respect for, but I cannot see how we can regulate this industry and you know, a suite of other associated industries effectively here, no matter what words we put into regulation, no matter what governance structures we assemble. This is a development of such a scale and such impacts that regulation will not save us, if indeed it ever could. But yeah, Kim and Diane, love your thoughts. Regulatory systems and frameworks.
Yeah, so I'll share that if you ask industry, Louisiana has some of the toughest environmental regulations in the world. We are one of a few states in the United States that has limits on the concentration of toxic air pollutants. So in the US, you know, we have a small list of pollutants that are limited, you know, nationwide. But then there's that much longer list of toxics, right? And it's up to the individual states. And so most states don't have any limits on those toxics at all. Louisiana does. So you could say, okay, well, Louisiana has tighter regulations. We limit the amount of those toxic air pollutants, you know, that can be in the air. But we set those limits over 20 years ago. We haven't updated them. And we don't actually monitor in very many places to see if the air is meeting those limits. So it's really easy to establish regulations that look good on the surface that don't do much to actually protect people on the ground. Diane, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know, like when we won that lawsuit, the federal judge, he said it in his statement, and I nearly fell over because I've never heard such truth coming from a judge before. And he said either the Texas State Environmental Agency doesn't know how to enforce, or they don't want to enforce. And so that pretty much says it about the Texas Environmental Agency. And I do know that I have been before down to the state, the district Texas Environmental Agency, like I was going through all of their books and looking for violations on Formosa. And I'd been there about 3 hours, and I had 2 investigators from the state kind of tell me to come here, and they pulled me into a corner to a filing cabinet, pulled out a file on all of this contamination and said, you do something with it because we can't do anything with it. And it's like, I mean, these were state environmental agencies that they could not, the politics of it, they could not go anywhere with that. And so I think this goes on all the time.
Wow, thanks, Diane. Yeah, so Maria and Helen had similar questions about the regulatory and compared to overseas and that. I think that the important takeout here is we haven't done so well so far in the NT. The proof's everywhere of mines leaking into the rivers and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, it doesn't look good so far. Okay, we've got a few more questions in the Q&A. Okay, what impact is the Kimberly fracking pool out having on our own fight here, especially with the company leaving wells operational with no funds to decommission? Kirsty, would you like to grab that one?
Yeah.
Or...
Look, I mean, I think that collectively the movement across Australia, everything is having an impact on our fight here and vice versa. And, respect to the people who are running the campaign for a frack-free Kimberley, and for Kim and Diane. The Kimberley is this stunning region in northern Western Australia, sort of the same latitude as the top end of Australia. And they are also confronting proposals for petrochemicals facilities and fracking as well. And there's been a story this week about one of the companies leaving, going bust, and leaving, of course, the taxpayer to foot the bill for cleanup. And that's just such a common story here across Australia and probably across the world. And this is the way that we regulate the resources industry in Australia. They internalise the profits and externalise the costs, including environmental costs, and we pick up the tab. And, that's what is happening with mines across the Northern Territory. It's what could well happen here if we go ahead with this, because that story is just, it's rinse and repeat. Companies going bust and we pay at the end in many different ways.
Okay, we have a question from Jess here. Question for Diane. Obviously, we would like to avoid getting to the position where we need enforcement of a project like the one proposed at Middle Arm. However, practically, how does your enforcement project work? Is it solely funded through fines? How did the judge come to this decision to instigate this community enforcement process?
Well, on ours, we had the trial, and the trial was put into 2 parts. One was, are they guilty? And after they were found guilty, the next part of the trial was how much were they going to be liable for? But Formosa did not want to go to that judge and be found, couple 200 million in liability. So he said, so Formosa was really wanting to negotiate with us. They wanted a settlement. So we met with Formosa and pretty much told them we wanted $50 million. We wanted all the lawyers paid. We wanted zero discharge of their plastic plant. We wanted enforcement. And that meant we got to select the people who would monitor, and our little trust fund would collect the penalties and use it in all environmental projects. And then they had to pay for cleanup. And right now they're in the middle of a 2-year cleanup that is probably going to cost $50 million. And that's just the river, that little creek things. So it was a consent decree we wrote up, and it was very well thought up. And then we had the Justice Department sign off on it and the federal judge sign off on it. And now it is anything Formosa doesn't do, we take them to court again. So you have to you gotta have a way that when they won't do what they said they're going to do, it'll go straight back to court. And so we got a federal judge, and that's how it's enforced. And so extremely important, extremely important.
Thanks, Diane. One from Duncan. In fighting to prevent this environmental disaster, should we suggest an alternative? $1.5 billion is hard to turn away. So we suggest another LNG plant. They exist now with no problems.
Might have a go at answering that. Look, $1.5 billion in a Northern Territory context is, of course, nothing to be sneezed at. It's a considerable amount of money that we would all like to see spent here in the Northern Territory. I would say I would reject the assertion that the existing LNG facilities, processing facilities in Darwin Harbour have had no impacts there. Some of the Darwin LNG facility and the INPEX facility are some of the largest emitting projects in Australia, and you know, hurtling us towards climate collapse, particularly if the new gas fields come online and provide feedstock for those processing facilities. And they are already having impacts here in Darwin in terms of air quality, which is not very well reported or recorded. You've got to sort of dig around to find those kinds of details. But we are working collaboratively with other organisations and hope to next year put forward an alternative vision for how $1.5 billion could be spent in the Northern Territory instead of on expanding the gas industry at Middle Arm, including for petrochemicals, but also for other facilities as well. And, you know, the mind boggles. You could retrofit public housing across the Northern Territory with solar panels, insulation, create thousands of jobs and reduce the cost of living for people here in the Northern Territory, which is rising. Or, you know, any number of things could be proposed, but we hope to have more details for you next year on what we're going to propose.
Thank you, Kirsty. From Diana Rickard, cyclones and storm surge worry us here. How did Hurricane Katrina affect industries? Maybe Kim, if you could.
Yeah, so it caused a lot of, you know, physical devastation. And it's funny because we had a hurricane, it's not funny, but last year we had another hurricane that's kind of fresher in our minds that you probably haven't heard about, Hurricane Ida. And same type of thing, right? So there's spills, there's leaks. The problem is that it's really hard to document a lot of that stuff because, you know, the air monitors are all offline, right? Like they're, you know, when we need that information most, we typically don't have it. When I was driving back from that hurricane last year, I passed an oil refinery, maybe 20 minutes outside of New Orleans, and there was a plume of black smoke rising from it. And there were, you know, lots of people captured pictures of that, sent it to our state environmental agency. And they said, oh, you know, it's just that the steam generator wasn't working. So normally you wouldn't see that black smoke because normally it would be mixed with steam and it would just appear as like a white cloud. So nothing to be concerned about, you know, it's just a lack of steam. It's no more pollution than normal. So, you know, the effects I think are pretty kind of straightforward to think about, right? You have leaks, you have spills, but you also have, you know, facilities starting up and shutting down their processes, which is a significant source of emissions, even if it's not sort of disaster type emissions. We had a hurricane in Southwest Louisiana, Hurricane Laura a couple of years ago, and for months afterwards, chemical plants were flaring to burn off excess emissions from kind of their disrupted operations. So it's really hard to understand what the impacts are, but we know that, you know, there's massive emissions that come during those critical periods.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Just for context for you guys in the United States, we do get massive cyclones here. We had Cyclone Tracy in 1974 that pretty much leveled Darwin and killed a lot of people and was very destructive. So yeah, it's certainly on the cards here to get a major Cat 5 or something coming through at some stage. Okay. Okay, Lewis wants to know, what are your positions for non-violent civil disobedience? I might answer this one quickly. Speaking of personal opinion, not representing the Environment Centre with this question, but throughout history, civil disobedience has been a crucial driver of social change, from the suffragettes through to the Martin Luther King and the equal rights in the United States. It's always been a tool used by people that haven't got power to get their point across. So in my personal opinion, sometimes when every other course has been every other road, you've been down every other road, and sometimes that might be the last card left to play to you. Anyone else like to speak on that one?
I'd like to say something because I'm a extreme believer in civil disobedience. Matter of fact, for I'd say 3/4 of the 34 years I fought the chemical plants down here, because you can't get help, you can't get from any agency, federal or state, you can't get the city to help you, mayors, nobody. So I resorted to civil disobedience, and I knew nothing about civil disobedience. I was pretty much a lone person doing it, and I did hunger strikes because it only required one person, me, and all I had to do is not eat. But I found out they were extremely powerful. I did a 1-woman hunger strike, and I did it on a shrimp boat. Then I got kicked off the shrimp boat. Then I sit down in front of the chemical plant and refused to leave. And believe it or not, I got my major demand in 2 weeks. It astonished me, the power that is behind something like that. It's like it shifts things. And so far I've did 13 hunger strikes. I have climbed chemical tires. I have sunk boats. I have went on properties, and I'm a firm believer in civil disobedience. I think when you're in a place where the typical route does not work, I think you have to take a stand and step out. You cannot, you have to be, I think we're way too well behaved. And that's why, I wrote that book on Reasonable Woman, because it was, I paraphrased, was it George Bernard Shaw? He said, the reasonable person adapts to the world, and the unreasonable person makes the world adapt to them. And so I believe there comes a time we have to be very unreasonable.
Nice, I'm with you, Diane. Okay, Freya. Diane, who checks the cleanup has been done adequately?
Oh, we're there all the time. Me and lawyers and couple water keepers. We are on them every day. They know our faces. Yes. Yeah. It's very much, you have to keep a hands on all the time, feet on the ground, boots on the ground. I'm out on the, when they're doing the, when they're doing a cleanup, and they got these huge drag lines and they're dragging to get the pellets out, and they have to keep a backfill and all this stuff. And it's like, they have to, the only way they can get paid is if we approve of what they did. So I literally go out there and say, okay, or no, okay. And it's like, you don't get paid if you don't get an okay. So it's this whole implementation of this whole consent decree is very much hands-on, and you watch it daily.
Thanks, Diane. Okay, the next question. What are the chances of the carbon capture and storage facility mitigating the carbon footprint of the hub? First, I might ask that to Kim. Is there any carbon capture and storage going on over there in Louisiana? And maybe Kirsty, if you want to speak about the local context.
So we are just kind of in Louisiana getting started on the carbon and capture storage craze. And I will say that pretty much the environmentalists down here are universally opposed to it, because it doesn't address the issue of toxics, right? So there's more that comes out of that smokestack than just carbon. And so for the communities that live near these plants, what we're seeing is industry kind of say, oh yeah, we'll control our carbon. Don't pay any attention to, what we're emitting. Don't ask us to reduce emissions. Just let us, try to handle the carbon and not think about the benzene, the formaldehyde, the particulates or anything else. We've also seen these projects be proposed in ecologically sensitive areas. We have a proposal in Louisiana to put a carbon storage facility under a freshwater lake that provides critical habitat for shrimp and blue crab. And so carbon, if it leaks up into an aquatic system, forms carbonic acid and can be a big threat to aquatic wildlife. So I think from our perspective here, it only addresses one aspect of a very big multifaceted problem of industrial pollution.
Thanks, Kim. And I would add that it doesn't necessarily address the carbon either. What we've seen in Australia is failure after failure for carbon capture and storage projects to actually store the carbon or CO2 that the proponents, the gas industry, claim can be stored. Most famously, we've got Chevron's Gorgon project, which was approved on the basis that they would store a certain amount of CO2, and it's just been botched event after botched event with massive amounts of pollution emitted. This particular CCS project that's proposed for Middle Arm is highly spurious. They're saying that it could store potentially up to 13 million tonnes per year. I'm not aware of any CCS storage facility anywhere in the world that has been able to store that much. And I would say also that whatever is managed to be stored, if indeed it can be stored here on the site at Middle Arm, would never justify the opening up of the huge carbon bombs of the Beetaloo Basin, which, as I said, will increase Australia's emissions by up to 22%, the Barossa gas field, which has a CO2 content of 18%, the majority of which will be vented into the atmosphere. It won't even make it to Darwin. So we have to be extremely careful about gas industry spin, about the benefits of carbon capture and storage. It might be useful for certain industrial processes for which there's no possibility of removing carbon, like cement production, but it should not be used as a justification for opening up new gas fields, which is precisely how it's being used by the gas industry and increasingly by government.
Yes, thank you, Kirsty. That's it for our questions and for our webinar. I'd just like to thank all of our guests today. You three guys are absolutely amazing. You dedicated your whole life to fighting for a future where our planet's going to remain livable, and that there might be a future for our children. And you've all done an amazing job at doing that. And keep up the good fight. And thank you all for attending. As I said, we'll post this on YouTube. And we'll send out around an email with a link to all the links in the chat, and also a link to the video if you'd like to share it wide. Yeah, thank you much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.